Cool. So, has anyone come across Moleskine before, the company? Yeah, we make notebooks. Did you know that they made apps? So we have a couple of apps. This one is TimePage, which is a calendar app, and this one is Actions, which is a to-do app. So my job is working at Bonobo as part of like a small remote team building the web version of Actions. This is another beautiful picture of our apps, if you want to check them out on the App Store. If you want to sit down with me and give me some feedback, I'll give you a free membership, so let me know. So this is the site, one of the sites that I've been building recently. This is a Gatsby site, and it uses style components and some of the other stuff that I'll be talking about later. I also built, so this is another page on the site. So this is a user guide for how to use our products. We also have an account site, so you can log in, you can see your memberships, you can manage your subscription, change your email, that kind of stuff. This is a completely separate site, so this is the accounts.moleskinestudio.com. So you can see some kind of similarities between the sites. We've got the same footer, similar kind of sidebar, the same logo, and the web version of Actions. This is the just the login page, obviously. All three separate domains, three separately built kind of sites, deployed sites, but they all use a series of shared components. So I think that's one of the really powerful things about React and the way that I'm styling these components is that you can bring those styles in with all your logic. You can make them behave the same way and look the same across all these different projects. So we have a a JavaScript library, which is actually public. So if you want to, make your website look like mine as well, you're welcome to. But yeah, you can basically just import the components. You can wrap it in a layout component. You can chuck the footer in there, and it will look like that, which is pretty cool. Who's a fan of React? Yeah? Who really hates it? Who likes vanilla JavaScript and doesn't want anything to do with it? Yep, cool. One, thanks. So some people think it's a bit overcomplicated. I don't think it has to be. I think you can get a fairly simple React app just like this. So this is kind of the very simplest React app you could build. You basically just import it at the top. You import your styles as well. You create a component, which is your app, and then you render that component down into an element on your page that has the ID root. So it's pretty simple. In like 10 lines of code, you can get a functioning React app that will, say, welcome to my app. Pretty crazy. So, style components. So this is the style components website. This gives a really quick example of how to make a styled button. But the thing that I wanted to show off was that we're actually on the website, which is pretty exciting. It's happened pretty recently. So you would take your React app. This is the bit that actually does stuff. The other stuff's just kind of boilerplate, so I've removed that. So this is how you would do it in the way before style components. So you import your styles. You have a class name on your div. You would add somewhere in your classes, somewhere in your styles, .app, and then you would write your styles about your app. You add a font size, a font family, that kind of stuff. So style components lets you create a component and apply styles to it at the same time. So we have a header 1 here. If you just do style dot element name, you can get a bunch of different types of elements. And then you're just writing regular old CSS. It's pretty simple. That looks like this. So you can see here, we've got isn't that fancy? You've got a randomly generated CSS class, or not quite randomly, but it's a unique identifier for that element, and the same is matched to some style that's injected on the page as well. So you've applied some styles, and you haven't had to worry about class names at all. which is pretty cool. It's freeing. You just worry about the style of that element and that component. And then later on, you can reuse that same beautiful heading across other pages on your site or other sites that you have. The other really powerful thing is that you can pass in properties. So here, you can see down where the heading is used, I'm passing in the family prop, and I'm calling it serif. We've also given it a default of sans serif, and you can see at the top here, my CSS font family has a function in JavaScript that's taking all the properties that I'm passing into that component and then getting the family prop out. And you can see what that looks like. We have another generated class name, and you can see the two styles side by side. So that's it. That's style components done. We're experts. That's how you use it. Next up, I'm going to talk about Rebus. So Rebus is pretty cool because they do a lot of the work of passing in properties for you. You have these 8 kind of core components that you import from, and then you can build up your layouts. You can build up your own kind of little styled sets of components just from these. So you have a flex component, which is like a flexed parent. You have a box, so you put your box inside your flex, and you get a flex layout. You have a card, which we'll talk about a bit later. You have an image. A heading just defaults to some kind of standard heading sizes. Heading actually extends text internally, but yeah, and then there's buttons and links. So basically, you can make any app in the world with these. Won't look very good, but it'll work. So this is Rebus. You can see that we've imported the heading component, which is a bit different to the other one, but basically you can pass in properties instead of having to use CSS. So here, this is an example component, and you can see that the font family has come through here, and that we've also got some kind of default styles. So by default, your browser will apply some margin on heading components, on heading elements. So we've removed that, and then we've also added a bold. Heading should be bold. Everyone knows that. Font size is really cool. So we have a theme that goes along with Rebus, and you provide the theme to the rest of the components kind of down the layout. So you have a wrapping component. It passes this theme down to every single component, and you can apply a set of kind of standard like patterns throughout your app. So here, I'm saying that in my fonts, in my app, I want the smallest font size to be 12 pixels, all the way up, and I want to use all of these font sizes, and I can basically pass a number instead of remembering font size 12 or font size 14. I can just say I want the 0th font size or the 1st font size. So here we've got font size 5, so I want a nice big 32 pixel font. And there we go. We have it coming across to our CSS. So this is a really nice way if you want to do, have a nice set of headings that go from, nice big header 1 down to header 2 to header 3, and then, your body size will be 12 or something, then you can sort that out pretty easily. The next thing is spacing. So MY in this case stands for margin in the Y direction. So you might have seen this in other apps. You'll be able to supply like a shorthand, something like MV or MH, I think, in various like libraries. Anyway, this is kind of the shorthand that Rebus uses. So you can set a similar kind of property in your theme, and you can say, I want a grid or I guess it's like a grid, like your padding structure or your margin structure to be like 4 pixels, 8 pixels, 16 pixels. So you can have elements that have here a margin in the Y direction of 3 means that you get 16 pixels above and below it. So a bit of space around your heading. And here's a bit more information on that. So if you use M just on its own, it applies margin kind of all around your element. You can use individual directions, and you can use left and right or top and bottom. And over here you can see a quick example. So you can pass in number 3 if you want the 3rd grid size, or you can pass in just a string with whatever you want your padding to be. So you can use different units if you want to use EMs or VHs or whatever you're into. You can do that. So here, this is a quick example of just Y. gives you 16 pixels, and then it defaults to being 0, and then you're overriding the padding to be 20. So that's pretty cool. It's a nice shorthand. And then we can do the similar thing with font sizes. So here in your theme, you have font sizes. You can see here 24 pixels and 32 pixels. But the really cool thing is if you declare some breakpoints, then you can make this a list or an array instead of just a single property. So here you can see that on small devices, under 40 EMs, which is under 640 pixels wide, I'm not used to using like EMs for breakpoints. The fonts will be small, they'll be 24 pixels, and then here on larger devices, anything above that 640 pixels, it'll be 32 pixels. So it's a nice way to kind of set out a responsive layout as well. And we're experts again. Easy. Look at that, learned 2 libraries. So now that we've mastered style components and Rebus, let's move on to a demo. So I had a bit of a browse around for things that I thought would be fun to build, and I found this on Dribbble. So it's kind of cool. You've got freshy bananas, you've got juicy watermelons, you can favorite things or heart them. So I decided just to build the kind of bit in the middle and ignore the top and the bottom, since that's kind of boring. So I'm going to try to build it. I'm going to run through a quick example. So I'm not going to do it live because that's a bit scary. So I'm going to do this yesterday as a live demo. So first thing is to pull out the images. So I popped into Photoshop, just rounded off and squared them up, exported them as a bunch of PNGs, and then that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. Look at that. You know your phone can control Keynote? It's so cool. And then I also pulled out the data. So imagine that you had an API that was serving this information. You know, you're making a shopping website for fruits, because that's something that you should do. So you could only see freshy bananas and juicy watermelons, so I improvised a little bit with the other ones. So we have spiky boys for pineapples. You got tasty oranges. And you can see there's a heart true on these guys because they've got a little favorite symbol. So we're going to build that as well. So this is what we want to build. So first off, I'm going to try and build a component that when you pass in a title, an image, and a price, you get something that looks like this. So this is just a screenshot that I've kind of rounded off and chucked in my slide. So first thing is to kind of map out how I want it to be structured. So this is the same as you would in just regular old HTML, but we're doing it in components instead. So the first thing is I want kind of a card that will contain everything. I'm just going to call it small card because they're only like 200 pixels, and I'm not very good at naming things. Then we're going to have an image, and the image will be sized to take up kind of this big square at the top, so it matches that, makes sense. And then we have a box down the bottom, and in the box we will have a name and price like centered nicely. And then absolutely positioned at the top right, we're going to have a little heart. So that's kind of one of the first steps that I would take, like building this from scratch in this live demo, is mapping out something like this, how I want it all structured. So it's a little bit more complicated. I want to be able to pass in the size as well. So you can see here, we've got the width and height. So the width of the card needs to be defined and the height of the image, so we get a nice square image. And then here we've got a little bit of padding around the box so that it can't like wrap all the way to the very edge. And then here we're fixing the price to 2 decimal places, so we get a nice 0.79 at the end. All right, so small card starts with a card imported from Rebus, whatever. I don't know how to pronounce it. And then there's a margin around it. There's a background. They have these kind of built-in properties for applying a bunch of kind of standard sizes. And then they have this CSS property where you can just add a bunch of extra stuff in there. So Rebus doesn't have to support like every single CSS property in the world. They can just let you add on a little bit of extra stuff. So here we're doing overflow hidden because we want nice rounded edges around our image. And we're also relatively positioning it so that we can absolutely position our heart a bit later on. Now we're going to move on to the 2 text elements. So we start with text from Rebus, and then here we're using a header 3 just as a demonstration that you can use non-div elements, since that's apparently good for accessibility. And we're applying a font size. So here we're using font size number 1 and font size number 2. I don't really know what that maps to, but it looked okay when I did it. And then we're centering the text, and we're adding a bit of color here, and we're adding a bit of padding to the top of the second one, so you get them nice separated. And that's pretty much it, fairly straightforward. So now I can use these two components that we've defined elsewhere in my app. And you can kind of build up these like complex, not complex, but like these layers of components into more and more complex and more like sophisticated components. So your components can be kind of composed of smaller components. That make sense? Cool. So here, this is the heart component. This is probably the most difficult one of all of them. That's why the text is like all the way over here, because there's room for lots more over there. But basically, I want to pass in a few properties to this SVG icon that I stole from Feather. Really good icon library. You should check it out. There is a React library as well that wraps all the Feather icons and makes them into this, but I wanted to modify the fill state, so I can pass in whether it's filled or not filled to indicate our heart status. I'll just let that sink in. You can have SVG inside JavaScript, which is actually HTML, and then wrap CSS tags around it. Amazing. So next up, we want to position it absolutely in the top right corner, and we want to make it look like we can click on it. So we're just using styled components here because that's a bit simpler. You know, we can kind of combine all these different libraries together because behind the scenes, Rebus is actually using style components or emotion. You can kind of choose which way you want to import it. And then here we have our kind of logic component. So usually I would separate out like the presentation components from the non-presentation components, if that makes sense. So here we've got some state. So we're using the new React use state hook, which is kind of cool. Came out very recently. Everyone's been using it for years though, probably months at least. So basically, depending on the status, depending on the state, we can either fill none or we can fill it with white. So, and when we click on the icon, it will flip the status from heart to not heart, from true to false. So now we have this, and we have our live demo. Here's me clicking on it. Ta-da! So the cool thing about this component, obviously, is that you can pass in a bunch of other, titles and images. So you can put in a cute dog, and you can import that like fruit card wherever you want. So if you want to use that same nice styled card, and have a love heart on it, then you can do that. It's all right. And then, because we want to be able to put all these cards somewhere, I'm going to make a layout to put them all in. So this is a flex container that's going down in the column direction that wraps at the maximum height and then goes back down there. And we're aligning everything centered along the flex direction. Is that the right way for align items? I can't remember between align items and justify content. They're all just, I just try one and then switch it to the other if it doesn't work. And then here, the cool thing about CSS as well is you can just pass in any child selectors or whatever you want. So here we can pass in the nth div child, and I want to apply a bit of a margin because I want to offset that down a little bit. And then our app becomes this, basically. So now that we've got our fruit card defined, we've got our column layout. I just made a phone layout, a phone component, in another slide. And then we've got some global styles which are applying kind of to the whole app. so not to a specific component. We're importing our data, which is our fruits. So here we're just mapping all the fruits so that we get one fruit card per fruit. We're passing all the properties through to each of those components. Does everyone kind of follow that logic okay? Cool. And we get this. Ta-da! So side by side against our design, you can see that we came pretty close. We built up a reasonably complicated layout in only, I don't know, 5 or 6 components. And we can then reuse that. We can put the same cards in a grid or in a CSS grid and CSS columns, whatever you want to use them in, you can do that. You can have just one large, like Tasty Orange or Spiky Boy just on its own. Cool. So that's it. So this is me. And these are the libraries that we're playing around with. Cool. Thank you.